They came ashore on the 6th of June, riding a tide of steel and liberation. They had survived the machine guns of the Atlantic Wall. They had fought their way off the bloody sands. But for hundreds of them, their war did not end in glorious combat. It ended in a quiet French garden or against a stone wall with a single muffled pistol shot. The killers were not faceless Gestapo thugs, but teenage soldiers of the 12th SS Panzer Division, indoctrinated in the Hitler Youth and hardened by the brutal ideology of the Third Reich. And their actions would unleash a dark shadow across the battlefields of Normandy, a shadow where the rules of war were replaced by a savage, whispered command: no prisoners. By the evening of June 6, 1944, over 150,000 Allied soldiers had a foothold in Hitler's fortress Europe. The British and Canadian forces, tasked with capturing the vital city of Caen, pushed inland, expecting to face the standard German Wehrmacht, a tough, professional, but largely predictable enemy. They expected a fight, but they expected it to be governed by the Geneva Convention. They were wrong. Moving to meet them was a different kind of adversary, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend. This was not a regular army unit. Its enlisted men were barely out of childhood, 17 and 18-year-olds raised in the Hitler Youth, their minds forged in the furnace of Nazi propaganda that taught them racial superiority and absolute fanaticism. Their officers and NCOs were veterans of the Eastern Front, the most brutal theater of the war, where the rules of war were often the first casualty. This combination, the ruthless experience of the Eastern Front and the blind zeal of youth, created a unit primed for atrocity. Before the invasion, their commander, the ruthless and charismatic Standenfurter Kurt Meyer, had reportedly told his young charges that this was a war of revenge for the bombing of German cities. They were not to be merciful, they were to be killers. On June 7th, the day after D-Day, the spearhead of the 9th Canadian Infantry Brigade, the North Nova Scotia Highlanders, and the Sherbrooke Fusiliers advanced towards the village of Authie. They were pushing into a trap sprung by Kurt Meyer's panzers. In a short, violent firefight, the Canadians were overwhelmed. It was the first time these young soldiers came face to face with the enemy. For many, it would be the last. The killing began immediately. As Canadian soldiers surrendered, they were not disarmed and marched away, they were shot where they stood. Witnesses later reported seeing German soldiers bayoneting wounded men lying on the ground. In one grotesque act of contempt, a German tank deliberately ran over the bodies of dead Canadians. This wasn't combat, this was slaughter. Prisoners taken at Buran were stripped of their valuables, their watches, their badges. As a column of these disarmed men was being marched to the rear, a German truck, clearly marked with the Red Cross, the international symbol of medical neutrality, deliberately swerved into the column, crushing 2 Canadians to death and wounding another. A short time later, a German officer, in a fit of pique, simply pulled out his pistol and shot another prisoner dead on the march. But the true horror was being orchestrated just a few miles away, in a place that would become synonymous with SS brutality, the Abbey d'Ardennes. Kurt Meyer had established his command post in the solid stone walls of the Abbey des Ardennes, a medieval monastery overlooking the approaches to Caen. It was a place of peace, now converted into a lair. On the evening of June 7th, 11 Canadian prisoners, a mix of Highlanders and Fusiliers, were brought to the Abbey. They were likely hoping for food and water. Instead, they were herded into the garden. They were not interrogated, they were not given a trial. One by one, they were taken into the garden and shot in the back of the head. The SS men assigned to the task fired their weapons so close that the victims' heads were nearly torn from their shoulders. The bodies were left where they fell, a silent warning to any who came next. The next morning, June 8th, 7 more North Novas were brought to the Abbey. They were interrogated briefly, but it was a farce. One by one, they were led to the garden. Each man shook hands with his living companions before facing their fate among the bodies of their murdered comrades. They walked into a garden littered with the corpses of their friends, knowing they were about to join them. The SS fired, and the bodies piled up. By June 17th, 20 Canadians have been murdered in that quiet garden. This was not an isolated incident, it was a policy. On June 8th, near the village of Château-en-Bassan, soldiers of the Royal Winnipeg Rifles were overrun by another battle group of the 12th SS. 19 of them were taken to the grounds of the beautiful Château d'Adreux. The German commander, a well-spoken English-speaking officer named Sturmbannführer Gerhard Bremer, personally interrogated 3 of them: Major Frederick Hodge, Lance Corporal Austin Fuller, and Private Frederick Smith. When they provided no information beyond their name, rank, and number, Bremer had them executed. They were marched into the adjacent woods and shot. Later that day, more Canadians were machine-gunned on the grounds. When British troops of the Dorsetshire Regiment recaptured the area the following day, they were met by the lady of the Chateau, Monique Level. She led them to the orchard, where they found 13 bodies in a row, still in their Canadian uniforms. The British medical officer, Captain J. Neal, examined the wounds. His report, which landed on General Montgomery's desk, concluded that these men had not died in a firefight. They had been stood against something, a wall, a tree, and shot, many of them finished off with a coup de grace to the head. Major Lloyd Sneath of the Dorsets looked at the faces of the dead. He recognized them. Before the war, he had served with the Royal Winnipeg Rifles. He was looking at his friends. The dirty war had found its first witnesses. News of the massacres spread. It wasn't broadcast on the BBC, but it traveled from foxhole to foxhole, whispered in briefing tents, and shouted across radio nets. The SS were not just the enemy, they had become the hunted. And the Allies began to change their own rules of engagement. A report from a British XXX Corps bluntly stated a grim reality. Many of them probably deserved to be shot in any case and know it. This is the point where the lines blurred. It's where we find the answer to our central question. What did German SS officers say when British troops stopped taking prisoners? The answer is not found in official transcripts, but in the panicked last words of men who suddenly realized the rules of the game had changed. The arrogant shouts of Heil Hitler were replaced by desperate pleas. SS officers who, days earlier, had ordered the execution of teenagers now found themselves staring down the barrels of British and Canadian guns, and they began to talk. The most chilling account comes from the Canadian experience itself. The policy of the 12th SS was made terrifyingly clear. But what did they say when the tables were turned? A British officer, whose men had just captured a group of SS soldiers from the very division that committed the murders at the Abbey, later recounted the scene in a private letter. As his men moved in, their faces hard, the SS soldiers didn't offer resistance. They dropped their weapons and, in broken English, began to babble. One pointed to his comrade and said, "He is SS. I am not. I am Wehrmacht. He is the one." They sold each other out in seconds, desperate to avoid the immediate justice they knew was coming. The arrogance of the master race evaporated in the face of front-line reprisal. There are accounts of SS men throwing away their distinctive camouflage smocks, trying to blend in with regular German soldiers. They would lie about their units, claim they were conscripted Poles, anything to avoid the fearsome reputation that preceded them. They knew that the no prisoners policy was now a two-way street. They had created a monster of vengeance, and it was coming for them. But in the midst of this savagery, there were moments that defied the darkness. On June 14th, a week after the massacres began, Sergeant Charles Eagles of the Durham Light Infantry found himself in a desperate situation. His battalion had been decimated in a cornfield. He and 3 other unarmed men were hiding in a ditch when they heard a polite cough. "Throw down your weapons, you are surrounded." The German major was a professional soldier, educated at Oxford or Cambridge before the war. He treated Sergeant Eagles with respect, sharing coffee and cigarettes, reminiscing about English pubs. The next morning, the major approached the young sergeant. "Things are grim. We are cut off. There is no way we can take or send you to Germany. In fact, I'd like to suggest that we surrender to you." 100 elite Panzer soldiers surrendering to 4 unarmed British troops. As the German major handed over his pistol to Sergeant Eagles, he didn't spew Nazi rhetoric. He didn't threaten revenge. He simply shook the young man's hand. I wish you luck that you may come through this conflict unharmed." As Eagles led his 100 prisoners through the lines, he stopped and looked at the major. He saw not a monster, but a soldier. He saluted him. It was a moment of old-world chivalry that seemed impossible just miles away from the blood-soaked gardens of the Abbey. It is a vital reminder that even in the heart of darkness, some men clung to honor. But it was the exception that proved the rule. The 12th SS Panzer Division was eventually ground to pieces in the Falaise pocket, destroyed by the very forces they had so brutally engaged. But the legacy of those first weeks in Normandy lingered. The unofficial policy of reprisal was an open secret. In one documented case, an American private, drunk on Calvacos, discovered a room full of wounded German soldiers and shot them all before anyone could stop him. A staff sergeant watched as a GI on a white horse singled out 2 German prisoners from a group and shot them both in the back of the head. This was the bitter fruit of the seed sown by Meyer and his fanatical youths. In the aftermath, justice was partial at best. Meyer was captured and tried by a Canadian military court. He was convicted for inciting his troops to commit murder and for responsibility for the killings at the Abbaye d'Ardenne. He was sentenced to death. But the sentence was commuted to life in prison. In a controversial decision, the reviewing officer, Major General Christopher Vaux, stated he was reluctant to hang a man for the actions of his troops without proof of a direct, written order. Meyer served 5 years in Dorchester Penitentiary in New Brunswick before being transferred to a German prison and released in 1954. He died a free man in 1961. Bernhard Siebken, the commander who oversaw the murder of 3 Canadians at his headquarters, was not so lucky. He was tried, convicted, and hanged in 1949. Wilhelm Mohnke, implicated in dozens of murders, escaped prosecution entirely. His case repeatedly closed due to lack of evidence. He died in 2001 at the age of 90. The majority of the killers walked free. The cynic might say that in war, atrocity begets atrocity, that the line between justice and revenge is easily blurred by the fog of rage and grief. The story of what happened in the summer of 1944 in the green fields of Normandy is not a simple tale of good versus evil. It is a story of how evil acts can poison everything they touch, forcing even the just to confront their own capacity for darkness. The SS officers who ordered the murders spoke the language of Nazi ideology, racial superiority, merciless vengeance. But the SS soldiers who faced the Allied advance, who saw their comrades shot instead of captured, they spoke a different language. It was the language of fear. It was the desperate, stammered lie, "I am not SS, he is." It was the whimper of young men who realized that the monster they had created was now loose, and it had turned around to devour them. They came to Normandy as masters. They left as victims of the very brutality they introduced. And in the silent gardens of the Abbaye d'Ardenne and the quiet orchards of Audrieu, the ghosts of 156 Canadian soldiers bear witness to the true cost of that terrible bargain.